Welcome back, guys. I hope you guys are all doing well. I was thinking about the rite of last week, or just the idea of a rite of passage last week when I wrote my article on it. And I think this is a really interesting thing because it basically seems non existent nowadays. I mean, there's no institution that can fill the role of a rite of passage in the first place. It's just, from what I've seen, what makes up a rite of passage cannot be replicated by really anything other than small groups like a family. College does not do it, or any other institution like college in no way does it. Because the rite of passage isn't just about going, okay, so you got through this thing. You encountered some trials, there were some tough times, maybe you learned something, and then you get a piece of paper saying you completed it. That doesn't count. I went through an EMT program. I have a piece of paper saying this certificate goes to Maxim Smith for completing the blah 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 blah. That doesn't mean I completed a rite of passage. It doesn't. It simply doesn't count. There's no institution which can replicate it. And I want to give you some examples of people of the past who used the rite of passage to make men out of boys. Because what we have today, well, we have nothing. For most people, it's basically, well, you're treated like a child up until the day you turn 18, or maybe a few months afterwards, because people will be nice to you and they won't ask you questions about what you're doing in the future or anything, at least for the most part, until you're a couple months into being 18. And then all of a sudden, so you going to college? You going into the trades, or what are you doing? You know? And that doesn't make sense. I mean, if you're being treated like a child up until the time you turn 18, and then all of a sudden, you're a man, when you've learned nothing, or learned very little, and you don't know how to act as a man in the world. You have no real skills, so what are you supposed to do? You have no framework of the world. You have no idea of who you are. And then all of a sudden, people want to pile onto you because you don't know what you're going to do. And I mean, of course, how could you know what you're going to do for your entire life? You can't, obviously. But you can have a better understanding of what you're going to do if you go through a rite of passage. I mean, Norse boys were expected to help run the family farm. And then once they turned 10 years old, then they could go off on hunting trips with the groups of men and start to integrate in with the men. And then throughout this time, which wasn't very long, the rite of passage was not very long, they would be given certain tasks, certain trials, which would allow them to gain certain skills. Once they completed those tasks, they were then considered men. One interesting thing about the Norse, though, the Vikings, is that you couldn't technically be considered a man until you had married. And most men would marry by the age of 12. So, which is a little young. But of course, these boys were more men than most men are today. So I guess, who cares? And then you have the toga virilis, in Rome. The boys of Rome, the more wealthy boys of Rome in particular, would wear the toga praetexta, I believe is how you say it, up until they were between the ages of 14 and 17. And depending upon whether they had reached physical maturity or not, and depending upon when their fathers deemed they were ready, they would then remove their toga praetexta and replace it with the toga virilis, or the toga of manhood. At the same time, or around the same time in Rome, in March every year, they would have Liberalia, which was a festival. And there was lots of Lots of wine, lots of drinking, and it was in celebration of the god of wine and fertility. So there was lots of wine, lots of crazy stuff going on, but it was also a time of ritual, a time where not only would the boys discard their toga praetexta, but they would remove their bola praetexta as well, which was a little amulet they'd wear around their necks made out of leather and gold. And it was designed, as the Romans thought, to ward off evil spirits. So they would put these bola praetextas on the altar and sacrifice it basically to the gods. And this could be seen as like a symbol of they are no longer in need of protection by the people around them or by an amulet. Instead, they are the protectors. They are the providers. They are not just consumers within the community, but they are the producers as well. They were men. They put on the toga virilis. They act as men. They talk as men. They walk as men. They are no longer children. They are no longer boys. They are the protectors. They are the providers. Now, of course, as soon as you donned the toga virilis in Rome, you had much more freedom as a man. I mean, that's when you'd get your rights as a man, is when you became a man and entered into manhood. But this came with much more responsibility. You had responsibility. I mean, after all, you're a man, and men have to take on some responsibility and act in the world. You are the protector, you are the provider. You have to fight, you have to die. And that's the last resort. You know, the last thing you have to do is fight and die. Until then, or maybe you don't even have to fight and die at all. But until that point, you are the producer, and you're trying to make your family and the community better as a whole, which is definitely gone nowadays. There's no idea of trying to make a family name. You like the Sackett's, the Louis L'Amour series, the Sackett's does. I mean, that's a perfect example of a family who had a name. They were known for being these honorable, noble people that you could depend upon. We've gone from Norway to Rome, now to Africa. The Maasai tribe, which is located basically around southern Kenya and northern Tanzania, I believe. And they had a unique tradition, a unique rite of passage for their boys. Sadly, they don't have any anymore, but they used to have their boys go off into the wild and hunt and kill a lion alone. But here's the catch. They could only do it with a spear. That was the rite of passage. If that boy could hunt and kill a lion and bring him home, then he had become a man. He had earned respect. And that's just a crazy one. That's insane. That would be, man, that's awesome. But again, this idea is everywhere. It's everywhere. And it's always been everywhere. But it's something we don't have in the world today. At least most people don't. Mongolian fathers would teach their sons the art of berkuchi, which is, I think is how you say it. But that's the art of eagle hunting. Not of killing eagles, but of raising and training golden eagles to hunt for you. To go out, you go out on a horseback, you would send your eagle out to catch prey, and the eagle would catch it and bring it back to you. And that is a clear art. And a boy cannot be considered a man until he had mastered this art, and once he had done that, he could finally ride with the group. He could ride with the men in his tribe and go out to hunt. Many of the North American Indians of the plains in particular had a rite of passage called a vision quest. Now there were other things like the sun dance too, which was brutal, and you definitely needed a lot of endurance and willpower for that, a lot of grit. But a vision quest was in some ways, a much more gentle way of pushing people through a rite of passage. They'd send their boys out into the wild alone. The boy would fast, he would pray, and he would seek guidance from spirits to discover his purpose, in what he was going to do in life, to discover how he was needed, how he could provide. The North American Indians would also teach their children their culture, the ways of their people, which is something we definitely don't have now. Definitely not at all. So there's basically 3 stages of a rite of passage. One is detachment from the former self. You are no longer even a boy. And that part of you is gone. That childish, very selfish part of you is put aside for the current task in front of you. And then, while doing this, you enter into a sort of liminal space, a limbo, where you're completing the tasks in front of you in the rite of passage. And again, you're not a man, you're not a boy, you're in between. And then there's the final phase, where you complete the rite of passage and you return back to your family, your tribe, your community, and you are seen differently. You have a new identity, you are now a man. Now, of course, this goes with women too. I mean, the only big difference is that the rite of passage was more so just puberty for women. So they would have celebrations about that, but for men, for boys, it was a journey into manhood instead of a physiological change. And I recommend everyone watching this, especially if you're a parent, to come up with a rite of passage. My father did it for me when I was 13, because that's a pretty good age for a rite of passage, and it's a pretty common age for it to be done. What he did was he wrote down our family's values, or things that are our family values, on note cards, and with that there was an explanation of the value as well as my task. For example, one of the things was basically endurance. And this isn't really it's hard to compare it to like a vision quest where you're being sent out into the woods alone as a boy. What I had to do was set up my own tent in the backyard and camp out there for the night. I couldn't leave the tent until sunrise, which still at that time was, difficult to do because it was cold, even though I had a sleeping bag. And it got worse because the sprinklers turned on at like 4 a.m. And so I was laying in a puddle of cold water, which did help with endurance. So we we got that part. So there was endurance. There was also hospitality, where I had to invite someone over for dinner and host that dinner. So if you are a parent, write down on some note cards. Make it a journey for your child to go through, and a rite of passage where they will detach from their former selves. And make these parts clear. They're going to detach from their former selves, being childish. They're going to enter into that liminal phase, that limbo, where they're completing the tasks that you set for them. And then they're going to enter back into your family with a new identity once they complete those tasks. And you have to really think, like, well, what does your family value? Is it strength? Is it wisdom? Is it courage? Industry? Ingenuity? Integrity? Grit? What is it? You have to figure that out, and you have to spend a lot of time on it. After all, you're creating a passage for your boy into manhood. You want to think about it. And my dad, one thing that was always very helpful for me was the stories my dad would tell me. Because stories are, if we didn't have stories, it would be worthless. Some of these stories were, all these stories were about family members, and the farthest ancestor back was John Howland, a man who is famous for falling off of the Mayflower while coming to the New World and surviving, actually holding on to a rope, coming off the ship, getting back on the ship, and then he got to the colonies. He was an indentured servant. He survived the very harsh winters here, even after his masters died, and he became a pretty well respected member of his community with a great story about surviving falling off the Mayflower in a storm. So there's that. There's also the story of my great grandmother George, which she babysat my dad when he was probably around 6 years old, and she had ridden on a wagon on the Oregon Trail. So stories about that, stories about another grandfather who worked his way up from being a janitor to the vice president of John Deere. You know, and you can find these family stories. If you find the family stories, you're really gonna help get the point across, and you have to form a big idea around those stories. Like, this is who we are. We're men and women of strength, of grit, of industry. We work hard. We get it done. That's what you want to do, is you want to form that familial cultural idea. Family culture ideas, how I should really say it. And then of course you want to have the trials. You need to have the boy go through trials within a rite of passage. There's just, I mean, you couldn't do it without the trials. The hard parts, and especially for me, the hospitality one was a big one, because I'm an introvert. And I definitely was an introvert then. Like, I would, even at 13, I would stand behind my dad in the checkout line, being like, oh, man, I hope I don't make eye contact with the cashier or something. You know, just something very introverted. So that was a difficult one for me. But all of these things you give within the rite of passage should involve a decent level of difficulty. I mean, after all, what do men constantly deal with? Difficulty. Now, in doing this, there's two main benefits of going through a rite of passage. The boy is then much better prepared to enter into adulthood, into manhood. I mean, within your family, he will be, once he completes the rite of passage, a man. Now the world won't view him that way unless he is 18 by that time. But he still will be much more prepared than everyone else around him to be a man. The other benefit, which is incredibly important, which I expressed earlier, is the idea of creating a stronger sense of family identity. You need it. You need a backstory. You need something to base your future actions off of. And if you have an idea implanted in your head of, my family is made up of strong, courageous people with grit, people who just won't stop, people who try and try again, people who are kind, people who are compassionate, people who are respectable, all these different things. If you have that implanted in your mind by the time you're 13, especially, life will just be much better for you. So institutions like college don't have a true rite of passage. You may go through a system where you do experience some trials and maybe learn a little bit, and then you get a certificate of completion. But you don't really learn, and you aren't growing as a person. I mean, you can definitely, especially say that with college. Most people definitely do not grow as a person. That's the point of a rite of passage. I mean, really, college is just a good of a replacement to a rite of passage as sand is to asphalt roads. That's the best way to put it. It's just not gonna happen. It doesn't compare. So, like I said, if you're a parent, you gotta design a rite of passage for your boys. For your boys especially. You have to. It'll I don't know a single parent who doesn't want to do good for their children. So, get started on it. If you are, let's say you're past the age of 13 and your parents haven't done this, or you're around that age, bring this up to your parents and say, I want you guys to do this for me because I want a rite of passage. I want to complete a set of tasks. I want to know what my family believes. Bring it up to them. And if you're around my age, around 18, what can you do? Well, instead, you're going to have to find those stories from your family. And you're going to have to create your own rite of passage. You're going to have to figure out what you believe. Do you want to be a man of strength, of courage, of grit, of industry? Okay. What tasks do you have to do which will make you feel uncomfortable? Very uncomfortable in some cases. And they should. That are going to test you. Find those tasks and complete them. And it doesn't really matter if your family doesn't see you as a man necessarily, but once you complete those, you will see yourself as a man, which is the important part. But definitely if you're a parent, you've got to do this. Got to. It's been done for an untold amount of time for a reason. And now in recent years it's completely vanished. We have to bring it back. Anyway, it's been a very long video. I hope it's been helpful to you guys, but yeah. I enjoy making these videos again. I hope you guys have a great day, and I'll see you guys next time.